Welcome to a town hall co-hosted between Protect the Porkies and Citizens for a Safe and Clean Lake Superior. My name is Tom Grotwall. I'm a resident of Wakefield Township near the proposed Copperwood mine, and I'm joined today by Jane Fitkin of Citizens for a Safe and Clean Lake Superior. Protect the Porkies works in a coalition with many different organizations. We ourselves are a member of the Upper Peninsula Environmental Coalition, and we work closely with many groups such as the Michigan Environmental Council, Freshwater Future. But from the very beginning, Citizens for a Safe and Clean Lake Superior has been our main partner in this fight against the proposed mine. So we're very pleased to have Jane with us today. Later on, after both of our presentations, we're going to hold a raffle and you'll have a chance to win a campaign t-shirt. So we'll maybe give out two or three of those, but you'll have to stay tuned for a good 45 minutes. And without further ado, I will pass the microphone over to Jane. Her organization, Citizens for a Safe and Clean Lake Superior, first rose into prominence in response to a proposed rocket launch site right on the shore of Lake Superior outside of between Marquette and Big Bay, and they managed to defeat that proposition because clearly that is just too evil to be launching rockets directly off the shore of Lake Superior, but it required a people's movement to defeat it, and Jane was a part of that. So I'm going to stop yammering and pass the microphone over to you, Jane.
Awesome. Thanks, Tom. And thanks everybody for coming out today. I'm going to figure out how to share my screen real quick with you. I think I'm going to do it here. Awesome. And let me figure out how to present. We're just going to go like this. All right. Can everybody see?
I can see it.
Okay, great. Thanks, Tom, for your introduction, and thank you all for coming today to this town hall. Like Tom said, my name's Jane. I'm the director of Citizens for a Safe and Clean Lake Superior, and I'm going to give you an overview of the Copperwood Mine. So let's get started. First, I just want to orient us to where we are and what it is that we care about. So, on the left here, I've got a photo of the Presque Isle River within Porcupine Mountain State Park. The Presque Isle River drains into Lake Superior and is a gorgeous river for many reasons. If not for, the fish populations that it holds, for the shale bedrock that sits below it, and the wonderful potholes that it holds within the river, if you've ever been there. A few quick facts about Porcupine Mountain State Park. It is partially a designated wilderness area, which holds old growth forest, including mostly old growth hemlock, which is one species that is incredibly important here as it's one of the oldest growing species of trees in Michigan, and it's threatened currently by an invasive pest that threatens to wipe out our hemlock forest. So we want to really protect our forests, especially hemlock. Porcupine Mountain State Park also holds lots of water, all of which drains directly into Lake Superior. And many of you who've been on this call, if you care about this issue, it's likely because you either live near or have been to Porcupine Mountain State Park, and you're not alone. Porcupine Mountain State Park was ranked the most beautiful state park in the country by Yelp reviews just a few years ago. And Yelp reviews are crowdsourced, so that means that the people are choosing that the Porcupine Mountains are the best state park because it's so rugged and beautiful and directly on Lake Superior, this is a sunset on her shores not too long ago. Lake Superior is the largest, coldest, and cleanest of the Great Lakes. She's actually the largest freshwater lake on Earth by surface area, and she holds 10% of Earth's surface fresh water. So we really want to be protecting the lake and Porcupine Mountain State Park. And here, this is kind of an iconic overlook at Lake of the Clouds. at Porcupine Mountain State Park. This is a photo that I took just a few years ago during a visit in the fall time. And what's interesting about this photo, and I guess any photo that's taken from the Lake of the Clouds overlook, is that in relation to this mine that we're talking about tonight, is that the company has admitted in conversations with the DNR that the tailings pond that they propose to build would be visible from this very overlook. So you're looking here, at Lake of the Clouds. It's a beautiful overlook, but if you looked to your right, you would see the tailings pond in the distance. And so we want to prevent that from happening. Let's orient ourselves in Lake Superior's watershed. So Lake Superior is vast. We've already covered that. We can see that this this green dot here is where Porcupine Mountain State Park is. And so the Copperwood mine is proposed for right here directly on the lake shore. And you see that Lake Superior's watershed encompasses, a large portion of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan and Canada as well, and a few other states as well. Copperwood also sits firmly within the 1842 treaty boundary. So it's the ceded land of tribes including Red Cliff, Bad River, Keweenaw, Lockview Desert, and a few others. And you know that many people will say that mining is our heritage in the Upper Peninsula, but we know that many people have been around here for much longer than we've been mining. And we would counter that mining is our culture by saying instead that Lake Superior is our culture. The reason why they say that that mining is our culture here is because we've fallen into kind of a blessing and a curse of having a lot of resources in the Superior region. So this map shows you kind of basically the bedrock geology of the region. So we've got Copperwood over here and White Pine, which is a mine, an old mine that's closed down in 1997 that they're trying to revive as well. And we see this right here. If you guys can see my mouse, the um, this shows the copper vein that runs through the Keweenaw Peninsula, and over the last 100 years plus, we've seen many copper mines take up and then board up shop along this peninsula, leaving often Superfund sites and pollution along Lake Superior on their way. Um, and so those mines that were prevalent during the copper boom were all mining, and even prior, there were Native Americans have mined copper, but it wasn't sulfide mining the way we mine now today. Back in the day, during the copper boom of the 19th and 20th centuries, we were mining mostly native copper. And what that means is that native copper is a form of copper it's like 99% pure, comes in nuggets, you can pull it out of the ground. Though they mined so heavily during the 19th and 20th centuries that all of that native copper is gone. There's not enough of it left to mine profitably. So instead, since the 1950s, when the White Pine Mine opened, all copper mining in the Lake Superior region is sulfide mining, which mines copper at a much lower ore grade of 1 to 3% compared to that, much more pure, like closer to 100% pure copper rate of native copper mines. So we're now being forced to use or choosing to use significant post-processing and chemical processing to extract 1 to maybe 3% copper from often sulfide-bearing hard rock. And so the Copperwood mine is no different. Exploration in the early 2000s and drilling sites, you can see this map shows the average ore grade of the Copperwood mine site, and all those holes are drilling locations. So they were exploring in the early 2000s and they found a copper deposit now known as Copperwood on the western edge of the Porcupine Mountain State Park. The average ore grade of this deposit is 1.45%, which is so incredibly low. It means that 98.5% of what comes out of the ground is waste. It's not stuff that they want to keep, and it will be stored on site forever. We see in this map that the red shows the highest grade copper on the site, which is about 2%, and it's notably closest to the lake. The mine is permitted to mine for copper up to 100 feet from Lake Superior, and that's only related to permitting guidelines. And we would not necessarily be surprised if we expected them to ask in the future to try and change the regulations to be able to eventually mine underneath the lake. And this property, the mineral rights have been owned by a couple of different companies, but now the property containing the Copperwood deposit is owned by a Canadian company, which many of you are likely familiar with this point, Highland Copper, who has never operated a mine. So just to give you, you've probably seen this map before, but just to give you an idea of where Copperwood sits, this blue stripy area shows Highland Copper's surface rights, and the purple is Highland Copper's mineral rights, and then the Copperwood deposit is in black. And you can see, yeah, it's not only just right next to Porcupine Mountain State Park, it's directly on Lake Superior, near the Black River Harbor, which is another important river, directly on the Presque Isle River, and the North Country Trail also runs right through here. A site map brings us even closer to show you that, what are they proposing to put on this land? Largely this big yellow block, which is a tailings disposal facility or a tailings pond, where they propose to store 30 million tons or more of mining waste. And you can see there's a lot of, rivers, wetlands running through this area. Well, in 2018, the mine got a permit from the state of Michigan, despite not having the finances to be able to complete the project or open the mine. Were granted a permit to fill 60 acres of wetlands, in order to build this tailings pond. And because they got that permit in 2018, permits expire after 5 years, so they have already completed those impacts and they've already started working on this mitigation area where they're trying to turn forests into wetlands by clear cutting, and digging and planting probably largely cattails. And we know that creating wetlands is not the same as having natural wetlands in our area. And this tailings disposal facility, you'll see, this little girl up here in the corner is Lake Superior. The tailings facility is less than 2 miles from Lake Superior, 1.78 miles, in fact. And so we ask, when you're putting a tailings dam that close to Lake Superior, well, is it designed to withstand the weather events? Copperwood's 323 acre tailings dam is designed to withstand 1 in 100 year storm events. These are fairly severe storm events. However, we've seen the occurrence of not one, but two very severe 1 in 1,000 year storm events in the immediate vicinity in Gogibic County in the past 10 years. These are photos from the Gogibic County Road Commission that show just some of the damage from these 1 in 1,000 year storms. These tear out roads and bridges and likely would definitely be able to tear out a full earthen tailings dam holding back 30 million tons of mine waste. So, I'm kind of building the case of like tailings dam failure likely at the Copperwood mine. What happens when tailings dams fail? So this is a video.
It's been 10 years since what remains the worst mine waste disaster in Canada's history. The collapse of a tailings dam at Mount Poly copper and gold mine in
This was a tailings dam in British Columbia, held under North American regulations, and yet the tailings dam failed. And
a massive tailings dam at the mine about 56 kilometers northeast of Williams Lake failed, sending over 20 million cubic meters of mining wastewater into nearby Quesnel Lake. Poly Lake, Hazel.
So This tailings mine collapse sent 20 million cubic meters of mining waste and was completely catastrophic. This is a news article that talks about it 10 years later, as you can see from the heading. The Copperwood mine again plans to store 30 plus million tons of mining waste. I haven't converted that into cubic meters, but it's many more than 20 million cubic meters of mine waste, and they want to store it within 2 miles of the world's largest surface freshwater resource. And we're not just basing this worry on, past events that have happened in other places, but also models from the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission that show here, and I think it'll play fast for me, which show they've modeled tailings dam ruptures in each section of the dam. So this video shows if the dam were to rupture from the easternmost portion, which you can see, is the smallest portion of the dam. And you see that even if it was to rupture in this, smaller portion of the dam, the mining waste moves very quickly, it spreads out fast, and it's going directly towards Lake Superior. It'll fill up Gypsy Creek and go into the Presque Isle River and eventually reach Lake Superior in the quickest that it will reach Lake Superior in the event of a tailings dam rupture is about 25 minutes. And that is not enough time for emergency services to arrive to try to contain a spill like this. So we'd see a tailings dam rupture from the Copperwood tailings dam to be extremely catastrophic. And we again corroborate this information because we've got a tailings dam safety program in Michigan that is meant to, it's comprised of officials from Eagle that are supposed to make sure that our dams remain safe and that catastrophes like this don't happen. However, they released a report in 2020, or at least their association of state dam safety officials released a report in 2020, and they concluded in one of their very first lines of the report that the dam safety program is, quote, extremely understaffed to perform the mission of dam safety as mandated by the legislation, rules, and best practice of the state. That kind of speaks for itself that we can't rely on our regulators to make sure that our dams stay safe, especially when when the mine is proposing to store 30 plus million tons of mining waste on site right next to Lake Superior forever. So to kind of transition into another important topic on this, so there's a podcast called MERS Monday that's a legislative podcast that talks about things happening in the state capitol. This Monday, a couple of days ago, they interviewed Wakefield Township Supervisor Mandy Lake, who was down there in Lansing advocating for the mine, and for the $50 million funding of the mine that Tom will talk about later. And during that interview, she incorrectly calls, among multiple other questionable claims she incorrectly calls copper a critical mineral. Copper is not a critical mineral. Critical minerals are determined by the U.S. Geological Survey, and these are a couple of graphs that I pulled from the U.S. Geological Survey today on energy.gov, and they are criticality matrices, and they show, here's copper outlined in black, and they show that copper is right now in the near term nowhere near critical. It's neither of high importance to energy yet, nor is it risking a supply shortage. Even in the medium term for the next 10 years, we see it rise in terms of importance to energy. That's due to our transition to renewable energy largely and electric vehicles. But we don't see the U.S. Geological Survey and like the highest officials in this country looking at mineral supply, seeing copper as being at risk of a lack of supply. And, that kind of contributes to this fact that copper is a volatile mineral in terms of its pricing. So copper prices raise and lower somewhat quickly, and that causes a phenomenon called flickering in copper mines that makes it so that they shut down and open up based on the price of copper, which kind of keeps people who are working at those mines and living in the communities where the mines operate in a period of economic turmoil and not having stability. And the white pine gives us a bit of an example of that. The white pine mine, again, is Michigan's first copper sulfide mine, I believe, is Michigan's first copper sulfide mine. It's on the other side of Porcupine Mountain State Park from Copperwood, and it opened in 1955 and employed over 1,000 people at the mine. The White Pine Mine closed in 1990 from 1995 to 1997 when the price of copper dropped and costs were too high in order for them to improve their infrastructure. And its closure left the Western UP in economic despair and having a legacy of blighted land. And I just saw an archived article earlier today and this is a quote from that from 1995. And one local official described the mine's last day as a funeral, saying except that only 1,000 people died instead of just one. So we see, that mining, even, these large mines, they close and they throw communities into economic ruin. And also leave a legacy of blighted land. So these are white pines tailings dams. They're much larger than what's proposed at Copperwood, being at 2.75 miles wide and just over 2.5 miles from Lake Superior. They leave quite the scar on our landscape, and they've been there, since the mine opened in 1955, and no cleanup has been done since they closed in 1995. And they'll continue to be there until they either open the mine back up or don't. So yeah, so that's kind of talking about the historical perspective of, why do mines not work in our communities? But hey, what about the jobs? This is the argument that most of the proponents of the mine try to really hammer home, and that's certainly what Mandy Lake was talking about on Monday. So it's true. Copperwood claims that they'll create 380 direct mining jobs. This is text from the grant proposal that is currently pending in the Senate Appropriations Committee that we defeated twice last year in the Senate Appropriations Committee. And in this grant text, for those that have seen it before or those who haven't, Copperwood claims, or Highland Copper specifies that a mining job counts as a qualified job to count towards their 380, even if it's maintained for only the previous 6 months. And they can employ either a Michigan resident whose state income taxes are withheld by the company, or a non-resident who is employed by the company or a specialized employer. So they're specifying that they want to hire people who are non-residents. And who are these specialized employers? Well, the other critical material mine in the region is Eagle Mine. This is another excerpt from their grant proposal. And they claim that they hope that when Copperwood achieves production, it will generally coincide with the end of mine life for Eagle Mine, and that Highland Copper will make every effort to work with Eagle Mine to retain the talent pool, construction, and logistics efficiencies existing in the area. So the company is telling us right here in this grant proposal that there is no guarantee that those jobs will be long-term or will employ local people. And even if they do employ local people, we have a couple of very reliable studies from nationally recognized researchers that, and this quote comes from James Stock, who completed this study, and says that in 89% of cases, copper mining, especially in rural areas that rely on recreation as another industry, in 89% of cases, copper mining ends up being a negative for jobs and a negative for incomes. We see that mining employment benefits peak within the first few years of the project and then continue to drop as the years go on because of the externalities associated with the mining industry. And this was the most comprehensive study ever done of mines in not in rural regions, and it concluded that 46, almost half of mines result in adverse long-term economic impacts to their communities, and only 29.2% of mines have favorable long-term economic impacts. But those 29% of mines that had a positive impact, almost all of them closed before 1980. So we see that the White Pine Mine employed over 1,000 people. The Copperwood Mine hopes to employ about a third of that. So we're not seeing that mines nowadays have the same economic benefits, even that they once had. So just to recap here, got a few statistics for you. So the estimated mine life at Copperwood is 11 years. About as long as your dog might live, but definitely not as long as your career will be. Most people's working portion of their life is about 45 years, from about when you're 18 to a little over the age of 60. But so, this mine will definitely not be a permanent job for you or your family, but what will be permanent is the 30 plus million tons of mine waste stored on site forever within 2 miles of Lake Superior. So just to wrap up, I just want to remind we all know this. Lake Superior belongs to all of us. So many thousands and millions of beings rely on her for survival, whether for fresh drinking water or the vegetative buffer that she provides throughout her watershed. And so as she sustains our life, it is our responsibility to sustain her. And to do so, we need to stop this mine from happening. So thank you all so much for listening to me. I apologize if I rambled on. Yeah, and thanks so much. I'll pass it to Tom.
Thank you so much, Jane. That was very insightful, and I learned some good stuff that I had not heard before. So now I'm going to follow up with Jane's presentation, and we're going to talk about the grants that is being proposed. But first, I want to address a question that we frequently hear, which is, but if the mine complies with regulations, then why worry? And in the back of this image, you see what regulations look like, a whole bunch of paper. Surely there is nothing that could conquer this stack of paper. What could possibly go wrong if we have a stack of paper protecting us? And at the end of the day, that is what a permit is. It means you filed the right paperwork. It does not mean you have Superman at your disposal. So first, let's talk about, as Jane mentioned, the Porkies have been ranked as the most beautiful state park in the entire country and are a jewel in the Michigan State Park system, the largest old growth wilderness area in mainland Michigan. And right next to the park, in the immediate buffer zone, we would have 24-hour lighting pollution, noise pollution from rock grinding, from heavy industrial traffic, from conveyance systems, from subterranean blasting, from air exhaust systems. And all of that would be completely permitted in compliance with regulations. There's that map again. This map for most folks is really the beginning and end of the conversation. If this location at the juncture of the Porcupine Mountains, most beloved state park in Michigan, for many in the entire nation, right next to the North Country Trail, right next to Lake Superior, if that's not an appropriate location for a Walmart, then why would it be an appropriate location for a metallic sulfide mine? At the end of the day, we will be dismissed as an anti-mining campaign by some. We're simply stating a common sense fact that this is not an appropriate location for any sort of heavy industrial activity whatsoever. Here are some other fully permitted activities. You see the mine exhaust vent, which the permit for that was recently renewed by Michigan's regulatory agency, would be within 150 feet from the state park. And that 30 million ton waste facility that Jane spoke of would be also in extreme proximity to the state park. And that's all in compliance with permits. There's some of that infrastructure right next to the North Country Trail, including explosives plants, sewage lagoons, ore stockpiles, the massive waste facility, all in compliance with permits. And in compliance with permits, well, first of all, to really show you the proximity to the state park, there you saw the state park entrance sign, and a literal stone's throw down the road, this is the Copperwood entrance road. So they are next door neighbors. There's a Copperwood employee coming out right now. So right next to the most beautiful state park in Michigan and perhaps in the entire country. Highland Copper, the mining company, has destroyed and been permitted to destroy over 60 acres of wetlands. In response, they are making new wetlands. This is what their new wetlands look like. So they're permitted to make 18 acres of new wetlands in order to compensate for the 62 that will have been destroyed. That's a net loss of over 43 acres. And these wetlands, so-called wetlands, you'll notice they aren't especially wet. You'll see a real wetland on the right there. That is a naturally occurring wetland. These were made last year by Highland Copper. You see there's a tube that goes from the real wetland into the new one. And they're hoping that water and life will return there. Of course, nature is resilient. One day, this area will be repopulated with life, but the studies show that these Franken wetlands that have been made by humans are overwhelmingly populated by invasive species. They do not compare to the real wetlands. These are some other clearings that exist on the site. There have been streams rerouted. As you saw from that image next to the North Country Trail, there's quite a few facilities that are being proposed. And right now, the Copperwood site, it's still very much in the pre-construction phase. So that's what you're looking at is really they're just getting the canvas ready for when they have the funding to actually move forward. This is all that destruction that you saw right in the buffer zone of the Porcupine Mountains. It was all done just in case they have the money later to actually start a mine, which if we get our way, they will not have that money. Moving on here. Jane spoke of this facility. Yeah, 30 million tons of mine waste on gravity, on topography sloping towards Lake Superior, all very much in compliance with permits. Jane spoke of the White Pine tailings facility over on the east end of the park there, visible from satellite imagery. And we would be looking at bookending this incredible state park, the Porcupine Mountains, with two monumental waste facilities visible from space. We've spoken of light pollution, noise pollution, air and water pollution. Site pollution is another factor. As was mentioned, this waste facility would be visible not just from the Lake of the Clouds overlook, but from the North Country Trail and from Copper Peak. You've already seen the potential for a dam rupture at the Copperwood mine. That would also be in compliance with permits. Nearly every single dam that has ever ruptured in the world was in compliance with permits because permits do not stop accidents happening. They don't stop catastrophes from happening. But even if that dam were to hold, an independent study, a peer-reviewed study has shown that in an analysis of 14 copper sulfide mines like Copperwood, responsible for almost all of US production, 100% of them experience pipeline spills and other accidental releases, and 92% of them resulted in significant water quality impacts. What do they all have in common? They were all in full compliance with permits. There's a special kind of contamination called acid mine drainage, which is when the sulfide from the ore mixes with air and water, which results in the leaching of heavy metals from the waste rock, kind of like when you steep hot water over coffee and getting all that caffeine out. That's what happens to this waste rock when acid mine drainage begins, and the process continues for thousands of years. Of course, Highland Copper has paid for a consultant to conduct a study which shows that there would be minimal risk of acid mine drainage at Copperwood. Again, the study was conducted by a consultant of the company, a firm called Geochimica, which is based in Australia. They have a single employee. It's just one guy named Mark. He conducted the study. He's done previous studies in direct partnership with the company's CEO of Orvana Resources, which is the former company that owned Copperwood. And their conclusion is that Copperwood is at low risk of acid mine drainage. However, a real study, which was independently done, peer-reviewed, looked at 9 mines exhibiting acid mine drainage and found that 8 of 9, 89%, also originally predicted low acid mine drainage potential. So they promise one thing and then something else happens. We also have to look at who is writing the permit applications that are being approved. In this case, Highland Copper, the company that owns Copperwood, is using a firm called Foth Infrastructure. Foth also worked at the Flambeau mine. Here you see a quote from Foth calling Flambeau a very successful mining operation. And the paperwork that they did to get those permits approved made certain projections of how many contaminants, what level of contamination to expect from metals like copper, iron, manganese, sulfate. You'll see what they predicted here in that third column. What actually occurred was different from their predictions. There was 58 times more copper contamination, 47 times more iron contamination, 76 times more manganese contamination, and 2 times more sulfate contamination. That operation resulted in acid mine drainage. It resulted in a stream being a nationally impaired waterway. And the folks at Copperwood are using the same crew to do their environmental permitting. There's another factor, which is it isn't something that Copperwood would be required to obtain the permits for, but it would be in full compliance with the law, which is a 25-mile rollout of the power grid. So this is the best case scenario. We get a 25-mile rollout of the power grid, which then, long after the mine has boarded up shop in 10.7 years, opens the floodgates for ongoing development forever, new businesses, new mines potentially, right in the buffer zone of mainland Michigan's largest wilderness old growth area. So, as a recap, in full compliance with permits, we have over 500 acres of forest being clear cut, 62 acres of wetlands being destroyed, streams forever rerouted, water, almost 100% chance it will be contaminated, air, light, noise pollution right next to the Porkies and the North Country Trail, mining underneath the state park, 30 plus million tons of waste in unprecedented proximity to Lake Superior, power grids, cell towers, heavy industrial roads, which would shift the baseline of the area and open the floodgates for ongoing development forever. The $50 million Michigan grant that we're going to talk about soon is in relation to that last bullet point. They need the power grid, the cell infrastructure, and the heavy roads in order to even begin a conversation about construction. Another point that is very important, which we do not see the proponents of the mine ever mentioning, is that a operation like Copperwood does not exist in a void. It's not just a bunch of paperwork. So, for example, this article, this opinion piece, which came out in the Detroit News on April 23rd and was co-signed by 4 Upper Peninsula lawmakers, says that the solution to America's copper shortage is in Michigan, and Copperwood is the answer. As Jane elucidated, in fact, there is no copper shortage because copper has not been identified as a critical mineral, which means it is not at risk of supply chain vulnerability. However, even if we roll with their false claim here, the disturbing thing about this article is that there are absolutely zero mentions of Lake Superior. There are zero mentions of the Porcupine Mountains, zero mentions of the North Country Trail, and zero mentions of tribal nations. So they are approaching this project as though it exists completely in a void. No need to consider what is immediately next door. There was a podcast that came out just a few days ago called MERS Monday. This is one of the most listened to political podcasts in Lansing, Michigan's capital, where all of the important decisions are made. And in that last section there, the final 20 minutes of the program, they interviewed Mandy Lake, which is the Wakefield Township supervisor. And she spoke very passionately about the importance of Copperwood in creating jobs here, in improving the employment opportunities for folks like her son. It will bring in money for the hospitals. It will help us improve the school system, et cetera, et cetera. We can respond to all of those points. And unfortunately, we will do a follow-up podcast with this very same group. But she failed to mention Lake Superior, the North Country Trail or the Porcupine Mountains or tribal nations. The Porcupine Mountains were mentioned only once because she was responding to our campaign, but we see none of the concerns that Jane raised in her presentation being addressed. And when they claim that jobs will be created, whereas you saw Jane citing researchers like James Stock, a Harvard economist and former presidential advisor, who says that in 89% of cases, copper mining is a net loss for jobs and incomes. We do not see the folks in favor of the mine citing any research whatsoever when they tell us that the mine will revitalize the economy. And it just so happens that Mandy Lake is a co-owner of a excavating company, which that very first sentence shows is working directly with the Copperwood mine. So her family, they are involved in a subcontractor situation with the mine. They are paid directly by the mining company. We're not saying that invalidates her perspective, but it certainly is not irrelevant information either. And that just really highlights the difficulty of trying to find what is the correct information? What is the truth? Because people very often have conflicts of interest. And then when we go to the mining company for the truth, this is the very first page of their 500-page feasibility report detailing absolutely everything about their plans for Copperwood. And they have to mention what they call forward-looking information, which is full of risks and uncertainties in relation to the future price of copper, the costs of the project, the economic analysis, levels of employment to be expected, and of course, environmental risks. There can be no assurance that forward-looking statements will prove to be accurate. In other words, that 500-page report, no assurance that it's going to prove accurate. Readers are cautioned not to place undue reliance on forward-looking statements. So everything that we hear in support of this operation, it's important to know that it may come in the form of investor speak, which is based on speculative narratives that will attract capital to the project and may or may not prove to actually be true when push comes to shove and good old reality kicks in. On the other hand, here's a news story from February of this year. There was a county commissioners meeting in which every single community member present spoke in opposition to the $50 million grant to the proposed mine. However, when the news outlet asked a member of the community for comments, they declined due to fears for personal safety. So we have, on one hand, people who are given the microphone saying this is forward-looking information, don't even really trust it because it may not prove to be true. And then the people who are actually in the community who might want to speak up are afraid to do so because this idea that mining is our heritage has become so dogmatic that to question it is akin to some as blasphemy. So people, especially in these smaller communities where relationships are so tight-knit, it's hard to speak the truth if it will be seen as rocking the boat. So we need to take all of this into consideration when we're trying to tease out what is the truth, who has the most money to gain in these situations. And that brings us to the status of the proposed $50 million taxpayer-funded Michigan grant. Correction, Michigan grants. There has been a very important update, which we're going to share now. So twice last year, a $50 million grant was blocked that would have shown the mining company as the direct recipient of our taxpayer dollars. And that grant was ultimately blocked by the Senate Appropriations Committee. Senator Sarah Anthony is the chair, and she cited that action was not taken due to pushback from people across the state and nation. So I really just want to emphasize how important it is that our campaign is a coalition, not just of folks from the immediate area, not just of folks from the UP or from Michigan, but really folks from all over the country and even all over the world, because Lake Superior, old growth forest, the right of humans to find a moment of peace and quiet in nature, these are things that should not belong to a single township or a single state. We're really talking about universal human heritage and the heritage of life here, all of the incredible life forms that are here that don't get to go to Lansing and lobby. So we really appreciate the participation in all of our actions from folks from all over Michigan and beyond. She states that the grant that we defeated last year has expired. However, that statement had to be amended. It turns out that grant has not expired. The $50 million Michigan Strategic Fund grant is still active at least through September 30th of this year. If even the chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee is having a hard time getting to the bottom of this information, it really shows how opaque the situation and the status of the grant is. It can be very hard to find what is the status of the grant because we're in an unprecedented situation. They had never seen so much pushback against one of these transfer requests before. In addition to that active grant, a new $50 million Copperwood grant was introduced on April 23rd in the Michigan House as a legislatively directed spending request. But there's a twist, and we'll get to that. You'll see that this grant would also end up in Wakefield Township. It would be funding all of the same things as the original 2024 grant, including road upgrades, power grid fortification, and telecommunications infrastructure. And it's for $50 million. So it sounds very similar, except there is zero mention of the mine or of Copperwood in this grant proposal. So when we compare the two grants, they're asking for the same amount of money for the exact same purpose. But whereas the original grant mentions Copperwood and the mine 34 times, the one that was introduced on April 23rd mentions it 0 times. That may be striking you as somewhat disingenuous. I think you might be smelling some interesting odors in the room right now. And this should be raising all of our red flags. It's not clear if they are all in all requesting $100 million or if this is a method of we're going to fling both of these at the wall and see what sticks. But both of these grants are currently active. And that is what we need to mobilize to defeat for the rest of this summer, up until September 30th at least. There you have CEO Barry O'Shea on the right at a conference called Minds and Money. So what can I do? What can everybody at this meeting do? What can we encourage our friends and family and strangers on the internet to do? If you go to protecttheporkies.com right now and you click take action, that first button there, it's going to give you a few steps. The first one that everybody can do, and it'll take you 2 minutes, is fill out a fast action form, and that will send all of our chief arguments to all of the relevant lawmakers in the Michigan House and Senate who are going to be making the decision about the fate of these grants. Your second step is to make a direct phone call or send a personal email to the relevant lawmakers. And out-of-state residents are encouraged to participate in both of these steps. You'll find at protecttheporkies.com a sample letter that you can either use as inspiration for your own message, or you can copy and paste it directly, and you can send it to these lawmakers. A third step, which is very important and is really only open for Michigan residents, is to take advantage of going directly to your state representative's website or your state senator's website and contact them through the contact form, because these messages received through what they call constituency services are granted a higher priority than other forms of messaging, because they assume if you're contacting them through this method, then you are a constituent and you will be voting to determine their personal fate. So we really, every single person who is a Michigan resident here, please contact your state representative and state senator, even if they're not on that appropriations committee, which most of them will not be. All of these folks get lunch together. They go to the gym together. They go to the same parties. And our goal here is to really make sure we are involved in the conversation. Step 4, we are planning an in-person, face-to-face day of advocacy in Lansing. The target date is around July 14th and 15th. There are not a lot of active days where both the House and the Senate are in session in July and August. These are 2 months mainly of rest. So the middle of July, that's when we can hit up both the House and the Senate. We're looking especially for residents of the Upper Peninsula to join us. Everybody who participates will be getting a free t-shirt, and we're going to look at funding to make this as easy as possible for everybody. I think Jane is posting a link in the chat if you want to join this action. You can also reach out to us at protecttheporkies@gmail.com. Step 5 is spread the word. So, protect the Porkies. We are just a messenger. We're here just to communicate information which isn't easily accessible. Once you got the message, the ball is really in your court in terms of how we're going to participate. We defeated those grants last year because thousands, over 10,000 people at a minimum reached out to lawmakers, and we're going to need that to happen again. I know, many of us may be exhausted. We feel like we've already done this last year twice, and now we're expected to do it again. But that is really what the mining company and their proponents are banking on, is that the other side will just give up and think the situation is hopeless. We need to keep going because Lake Superior is still there. The Porcupine Mountains are still there. All of the incredible life forms that call that area home, they are counting on us not getting jaded and giving up. And, in the end, it's going to take less than a couple hours of your time being generous to reach out to all of those lawmakers. So it's a very small thing that all of us can do. Click that button at protecttheporkies.com. And, you know, remember that we are not talking about a void here. This is a real place where people come to enjoy peace and quiet in nature. All of these incredible life forms exist. And it was a place that Michiganders fought for decades to see protected, specifically from logging and mining interests. In really the peak of World War II, the Porkies were declared finally as a designated protected area. And so it is our role now to carry the torch that these past generations lit and make sure that what they protected stays protected. And I want to share a quote which I feel is very insightful from Henry David Thoreau, written 170 years ago in his book Walden. Is it not a maimed and imperfect nature I am conversing with? I take infinite pains to know all the phenomena of the spring, thinking that I have an entire poem. And then, to my chagrin, I hear that it is an imperfect copy I possessed, that my ancestors have torn out many of the first leaves and grandest passages and mutilated it in many places. I should not like to think that some demigod had come before me and picked out some of the best stars. I wish to know an entire heaven and an entire earth. What he's talking about here is what we call shifting baseline syndrome. Here was a guy who was looking to enjoy the majesty of nature, and he had to recognize that the trees were not as big as they used to be. The forest was not as pristine. There weren't as many stars in the sky because his ancestors, not even so far back, his contemporaries, were not taking care of the earth in the way that it was received to them. He's describing the exact opposite of what the native people call the seventh generation principle, where you are constantly thinking about the impacts of your actions, not just on the next generation, but on 7 generations down the line. So those of us who have been blessed to enjoy this area, this very unique area in the Upper Peninsula, we have to make sure that our children, grandchildren, and all of them and their peers are able to enjoy this area as we have today. To end on a positive note, we've got a songwriting contest going right now. If you know some creative musicians or you are one yourself, we're looking for compositions celebrating wild nature, clean water, and resistance to destruction. You can find more details at protecttheporkies.com. And without further ado, we're going to hold a t-shirt raffle. So I think we've never